Thank you very much. Let me firstly thank the family of Dr. Xum for honoring us, not just with giving us the go-ahead to name this building after their father, their grandfather, uncle, but also for honoring us with your presence. It takes a lot of effort and shows commitment to what we are doing here today. As you know, many of them traveled, ABC was telling me, it's more than 900 kilometers from Entombo to come here. So, Siamule, thank you very much. We want to thank you from the initial communication when we asked for permission, you granted us, and if you can also pass regards also to Ubabu Ukurei Kuma, who was the one also communicating with quite some time on a number of occasions. But in that regard, let me also thank our headquarters from the ANC for giving us the go-ahead to discuss this proposal. And I must, in that regard, recognize also Comrade Pito. Comrade Pito was at the HQ at the time when myself and former Minister Mkize, we started discussing the idea of the naming of the building, and I communicated with him to link us with the family. And through his intermediation, finally got the go-ahead. So thank you very much, Comrade Pito. So indeed, we are very grateful that after all that work, we are here today to come and formally inaugurate this, our headquarters, as the Dr. B Xum building. I believe that naming this building after this award, this very outstanding son of the Swan, serves multiple purposes, and a number of speakers have already touched on some of those. Now, one of those, of course, is also from the family, mentioned that sometimes it's normal human nature to forget some of the big and very important contributions by some of our people, and Dr. Xum is one of those who we felt that it's not recognized enough, and when you look at this background, he's really contributed a lot to where we are today. So we hope that by this naming of this building, it will bring to the fore interest by many, including young people, into knowing who exactly was Dr. Xum and looking at his work and contribution, not only himself, but also many other leaders and comrades who contributed to our freedom and democracy today. But also, just his life is, I believe, almost like a textbook of determination and resilience, especially in the quest to empower himself, to acquire education, to acquire knowledge, and to acquire skills. There's been a bit of mention about his background, in his determination to acquire education. Indeed, the more one reads more about him, the more you realize that sometimes you may think that you've gone through some difficulties, some struggles, but when you read the life story of Dr. Xum, you really see that things were difficult, but he persevered. Having completed his studies here in South Africa, as TG already mentioned, that it's not one documented. The fact that even though what he ultimately is known about is the medical profession, he was also a qualified teacher. He started as a teacher in the Eastern Cape at a very young age, barely 20. Remember those days when you you pass your standard 6, you could also do a teacher diploma. So he went that route, did the teacher diploma, actually taught. So by the time when he left South Africa at the age of 20, in 1913, he was already a teacher. He had actually already taught. Now, many of us, today when you talk about somebody going to study abroad, people just think about, of course, the money, the funding, and so on. And then you buy a ticket to get, if you don't have the money, get a sponsor to get the flight ticket, get what is this airline, Delta Airline or whatever, at OR Tambo. We complain about how many hours, about 13 hours, I think, straight flight from here to New York. I know it's about 13 hours. Now, Dr. Kuma did not fly. He went by ship, cascade. It's America's cab. It took him, if I read the history, not less than, it's about 20 days, 15 to 20 days. Yeah, he left with 2 of his friends who also wanted to study abroad. It took them close to 20 days. And they didn't actually have sponsors. There were no sponsors, there were no bursaries and sponsors. So he had to save money from, doing some jobs at home, save some money, of course, from the family also. Clearly there was small contribution, but at that time, there wouldn't have been much from the family. And then go to the US, and then even there had to hustle, getting peace jobs, starting, he didn't just go straight to doing medicine. He started with a number of different courses at different universities, working during the day. In his first few years, he worked during the day and studied at night. And still managed to pass a PSc, working during the day and studying at night. And from time to time, he almost abandoned his studies because of lack of funding. And he had to sometimes stop, go and get, and when you read his history, and he didn't choose. He would get to a university, look for a job in the kitchen, cleaning, security, all that, just to earn some money so that he can pay the fees. And also a little bit of that as pocket money. That's how over the years. And of course, having completed a BSc, then applied to one of the medical schools. He was they turned him down a number of times, he kept on, finally got an admission. And that was not the end. Even after getting admission, he did, I think it was in his first year, it didn't go well. He was a student. He was a student from the first medical school, went and studied further to complement to some of those courses, reapply and come back. And finally, managed to qualify as a medical doctor. So if you're looking for determination and resilience, that's really just a textbook. Many people would have given up, but he never gave up. He kept on. He said, I came here to study. Of course, when you read his profile, there are times when he thought, after his first degree, at some stage, he thought maybe he should come back home, but then he said, I'm not yet done. And we carried on and on. And of course, as already mentioned, beyond, even after all that struggles, after he got his basic degree, he went further. And from US, went to Europe, Eastern Europe, Hungary, and other places to do obstetrics and gynecology, carried on until finally coming back home. And when he came back home, as you know, Malika was mentioning, I mean, being, you know, first African qualified, as you know, those years, 1927, 1928, those times, the only place where, I mean, when he came to Johannesburg, he settled to make sure that he works amongst his own people in Sophia Town, in Johannesburg, where he had to look after the most oppressed, the most exploited and downtrodden African people. So he started this activism not just in direct political activism, but in his profession, in his professional work, looking after mine workers, worried about their conditions in terms of respiratory diseases, taking up their issues with the mine bosses, with the local authorities, working with many other activists to address the socio-economic conditions, because today in the sophisticated language we talk about the social determinants of health. He didn't have to read about something called social determinants. They were looking at him in the face, and he had to work with other activists like Charlotte Mateke and others to address many of those issues. He was also called upon in 1930 to become a part-time medical officer for Alexander Township. And over and above his practice, he agreed, and he carried on with that for another 25 years as a medical officer for Alexander Township. Now, driven by his aspirations and desire, Dr. Xum began to also, informed by those conditions, joined the social movements to agitate for equality and access to African people to proper health care. And also noting the racism which was underpinning the provision of healthcare services. In 1929, when he was addressing a meeting of the British Association of Sciences in Johannesburg, he argued that there was no acceptable substitute for fully trained African doctors and nurses, and appealed for the establishment of a medical school in South Africa that would open its doors to aspiring Africans to become doctors. So he didn't want generations which were coming after him to have to board a ship to travel for more than 20 days. And he spent, by the time he came back, he had been away for 14 years. He had been away for 14 years. And quite interesting, because he had been away for so long, it's written that when he was arriving, entering, they almost refused him entry into the Republic, because I don't know what was the nature of documentation at the time. Minister Mtwali must research what was the documentation, because it is written that he had a struggle when he was entering. They were now suspecting that he's not South African, that he must be a black American. They really had to question him, and it's mentioned that the family had to go and attest that indeed he is a Xhosa. He is not a black American. Of course, the reason also why in addressing this conference, he will talk about the need for Africans to have access to medical training. It's also mentioned that on his way back, when he was checking what is available for an African medical practitioner, he got into contact with Dr. McCord. Those of us who graduated in Natal will know McCord Hospital. I think he's the founder of, they said he was the founder of that hospital. Now, Dr. McCord was trying to recruit him to come and join him, and Dr. Xum turned it down. The reason was, Dr. McCord was recruiting him to come and train medical assistants, African, because at that time, Africans could only be trained as assistants, not as doctors. So he was being asked by Dr. McCord to come and join him to train Zulu, not even African, Zulu medical assistant. So then Dr. Xum turned it down and came to Johannesburg and started agitating, not only for proper health services, but also for training. But of course, because he was never satisfied with, even in terms of his own knowledge and skills, after some time he took some leave and went back to the UK to go and do tropical medicine and hygiene, because he wanted to make sure that as he deals with the situation in Sophia town, in Alexander, as he is engaging the authorities at the time, he can speak with authority, with all the degrees and also diplomas and qualifications, postgraduate qualifications, so that he can speak with absolute authority. And progressively, as he was getting involved with others in agitating for improvement of the social conditions of the African people, he moved closer and closer to the African National Congress. And ultimately, in 1939, he was invited by the Secretary General, James Talata, to attend the ANC conference. And quite interesting, because at the time, as you know, ANC also had a House of Chiefs. There was an ordinary commoners, members, but there was also a House of Chiefs. And because it was also, as it was established, it was called the Parliament of the People, the ANC also, TG, I learned now that we didn't just start by having a national chair, we had a speaker. There was a speaker in the ANC, and there was also a deputy speaker. And immediately at that conference, Dr. Xum was appointed, fresh as he was in the organization, for that conference to be the deputy speaker of the conference. And of course, with the way he distinguished himself as a deputy speaker, when the next conference was held in 1940, he was elected president. In fact, that time, it was not just president, it was President General. So you were called President General. So he was elected President General. And as already mentioned, Dr. Xum used his vast exposure throughout the world, from the US, where he interacted with a number of black activists and also some liberal white politicians in the US, and also time he spent in the UK. He used all that vast experience to modernize the African National Congress at the time, to give it more direction. And of course, remarkable in that it's the initiative to have a committee which he led to look at the Atlantic Charter and see the relevance of the Atlantic Charter to the struggle of the African people in South Africa. And that Atlantic Charter, as already mentioned by TG, was a document through which the superpowers, as they concluded the Second World War, led by Roosevelt on the US side and Churchill on the UK side, and other leaders came together to agree on the basics of how to keep peace in the world and how to make sure that there's peace and development. So through the initiative of Dr. Xum, this committee was established, and of course, as is now well documented, came up with a very, forward-looking document, the African Claims, which outlined the future, the aspirations for future political, economic, and social rights. But what is important also, I think, because of his influence, we find that the document is also very wealthy in as far as agitating also for changes and for transformation in the areas of health. Now, just in terms of, I know that at the launch of the signing of the FHI, the President also went quite extensively just to quote some of the excerpts from that document. In the area of health, it says, I quote, "We regard it as a duty of the state to provide adequate medical and health facilities for the entire population of the country. We deplore and deprecate the fact that the state has not carried out its duty to the Africans in this regard and has left this important duty to philanthropic and voluntary agencies. As a result of this gross neglect, the general health of the entire African population has deteriorated alarmingly. We consider that the factors which contribute to this state of affairs is the low economic position, shortage of land, leading to congestion, the slum conditions in which Africans live, and neglect of the health and general education of the Africans. To remedy this state of affairs, the African claims that make very clear demands. And it says that a substantial and immediate improvement in the economic position of Africans, a drastic overhauling and reorganization of health services of the country, with emphasis on preventative medicine and all that it implies in terms of public health. And he says we strongly urge the adoption of the following measures to meet the health needs of the African people: establishment of free medical health services for all sections of the population, not just for the African people, but for everybody. The establishment of a system of school medical services. So the school health services which we are doing currently finds its origin also from the African claims. The establishment of a system of school medical services with medical practitioners, nurses, and other health visits to the schools. Increased hospital and clinic facilities, both in urban and rural areas. Training of African doctors, dentists, nurses, and also sanitary inspectors. Obviously, this means environmental health practitioners in today's language. So these were the demands which, were made those many years ago. That's what, over 80 years now, almost 82 years ago. And Dr. Xum described this document as a living document, and he said that it is a legacy, a heritage, which I'm sure we can attest the relevance, that it is indeed a legacy, because it's still relevant today. The legacy, a heritage, and very prophetic, he said, which we will leave behind for future generations. We will leave this document behind for future generations. And he said, we realize that this is only the beginning of a long struggle, and it must be persistent and insistent. He said, I'm confident that all men and women of goodwill of all races and nations will see the justice of our cause and stand with us. So we're here today to immortalize this stalwart, this pathfinder, a leader, a nation builder. So it is not a coincidence, as the TG was saying, that we are doing this 6 days after the President signed the National Health Insurance Bill into an act. This bill, this law now, which is normally bill, the act, as we have said eloquently and also stated by the President, finds its origin from this very pioneering document led by the President Xum. So in immortalizing his name here today, we are also binding ourselves to the achievement of his dreams and his goal of a complete overhaul of a discriminatory and inequitable system of health services, as we still have a discriminatory and inequitable system. It may no more be racially discriminatory, but it has serious class discrimination, which we have to deal with. By so doing, we're binding ourselves to the deliberate and speedy transformation of our health system as proposed in the African claims. And we're binding ourselves to these dreams of our forebears. By this renaming, we also hope to inspire our staff here and also elsewhere, health workers everywhere, to learn more about this gentle giant and about his commitment, his fortitude, resilience, and also his commitment to discharging his responsibilities to the public, and that this can inspire our own staff, not only here, but also in the frontline services. That we must all learn to be servants of the people, as Dr. Xum was in Sophiatown and Alexandra. And in this regard, I would want to urge the DG and the team that I think beyond today, if we can do more, just to get many more of, just starting here at our headquarters, people to know more about these giants of our struggle and pathfinders in the health sector, the extent to which they are going to serve the people against all odds. I think if we can create, I know these days, instead of books and libraries, what dominates is something called social media. So I leave it to the gurus in this department